than any other studio I can possibly think of. They've been around and producing award-winning blockbuster crazy games for 3 decades. And this is the most biggest, ambitious game they've ever done. It's a game. It's a game. You have to experience it. That's all I'll say about that.
The Last of Us Part 2.
There's no way to adequately describe all of my thoughts and feelings about The Last of Us Part 2 without making a video which runs multiple hours in length. What I can do, and what I intend to do in this video, is to show exactly why I think and feel a certain way about things, both good and bad, with a series of key points. While I am fervently cognizant of the very passionate and devoted grouping of fans who admire and respect this story, even considering it a masterpiece, I cannot sit here and begin to explain with anything resembling confidence why those individuals could possibly call this game's story a masterpiece. The Last of Us Part 2 is a beautiful, well-designed game that's easy on the eyes with its incredibly detailed environments and level design. The combat improvements and wealth of new animations add to the gameplay spectacle, which is a significantly enhanced experience relative to the first game. Nearly every facet of Part 2 is arguably better than the first game, except for the characters and the story. Ironically, those are the 2 most important parts of a Last of Us game, and it's those exact things which hurt Part 2 more than anything else, and why, despite a lot of people tweeting up a storm to the contrary, The Last of Us Part 2 is no masterpiece. But before we get all caught up in the story, it is important to outline some specific aspects of the gameplay which helped make my experience much different from the original, but in a good way. First and foremost, the combat is for the most part a large improvement. After the initial 3 to 5 hours, The Last of Us Part 2 starts to abandon the weaker level design of its predecessor and move into expanded and enhanced play environments. These areas take advantage of multiple pathways and plenty of open-ended routes for flanking and experimentation. Giving this room for the player to explore the game's sandbox is quite possibly the single greatest choice the developers could have made. Not to mention, it's something I was desperately seeking to find in the first game. So to see them actually take a leap forward and innovate on the main combat loop in a natural and increasingly enjoyable way was truly welcomed in the time I spent playing the game. The AI is much smarter this time around and is much quicker to react to you. If you try sitting in one spot for too long, the enemies will rush and flank you from all sides in order to flush you out. The point is not to sit in one place and treat the game like a shooting gallery. You're encouraged to spread out across the area, be aggressive, be smart, and adapt to the situation as it unfolds. If you're in an area where enemies are patrolling with dogs, you have to consider taking out the dogs and their handlers first. If you attempt to approach an encounter with stealth, but you leave the dogs alive, it can backfire. Dogs can pick up your scent and track you, making simple stealth approaches far more complicated. Proactive players can use this to their advantage. In one instance, I let a dog catch my scent, then lured it into the path of a trip mine. If you find yourself in a sticky situation, pop a smoke grenade and try to evade the enemy rush. Players can try funneling multiple enemies into a smaller space and hurl Molotov cocktails at them to create some chaos.
Think that was her? I'm on it.
Nika, see anything?
Don't know what it was. Place is empty.
Jesus! No!
There's no real limit on how to use your imagination to incorporate the various weapons and equipment. Combat is a rhythm that reacts to the ebb and flow of your choices. If you get pinned down, chances are it's actually your own fault for hesitating and not being aggressive enough. The gameplay rewards experimenting and exploring the sandbox provided to you. So if you do find yourself playing this game, I highly recommend getting creative whenever possible. Beyond a positive gameplay experience, we find arguably the best attribute of the game, its appearance and presentation. The Last of Us Part 2 is almost assuredly one of the best looking games on consoles, and that's not even up for debate. The attention to detail and care taken to make the characters and the world around them feel as realistic as possible is nothing short of incredible. Environments are full of personality, with remnants of a once prosperous human race being slowly overtaken by flora and wild landscapes. The earth is seemingly reclaiming its ground, and what's left is simply a corroded memorial to what America used to be, decades prior. The open, explorable portion of Seattle is a thoroughly breathtaking sight. A monumental effort was surely taken in recreating large chunks of the city with such impressive detail. The time the player spends roaming this region is not easily forgotten. Various districts and locales within Seattle offer the same gorgeous apocalyptic beauty. The majestic horizons you traverse on Ellie's quest for Abby show just how hard the artist and level design teams worked to bring their A game. The grass, bushes, trees, algae-coated water, and lush, verdant habitats of the city blocks, streets, and suburbs make for an appearance which is reminiscent of the overgrown New York City from Crysis 3. Few games have offered such haunting and wondrous play environments. The Last of Us Part 2 pushes the boundary on what one can expect from a game's presentation. It isn't just Seattle, though. The time we spent inside and outside of Jackson and even in Santa Barbara allows for vistas and sights the likes of which many games could only dream of achieving. It's a testament to the diligent workers at Naughty Dog who poured so much effort into crafting these gorgeous levels that the game looks as good as it does even on a base PS4. It's a shame that for all the good this game has to offer, its story should be one riddled with contrivances, plot holes, and radically inconsistent writing. The narrative is, in no uncertain terms, a complicated mess that loses itself in a bloated, unfocused series of subplots. Many of the subplots are hastened to the finish line without letting the pacing or characters breathe, while others are practically abandoned altogether. The game promises much, but delivers very little. There were a good number of interesting ideas, but due to the game attempting to tackle too much all at once, these ideas are never given the love or attention they need. In other words, The Last of Us Part 2 is not a complete game. It's an amalgamation of 3 separate games forced to coexist in one single storyline. If the pacing feels terrible and the execution feels off, it's probably because the game's reach far exceeds its grasp.
Joel, get up. Joel, get up. Please stop.
Before I can even begin to discuss the many narrative-related issues in this video, I have to touch on Joel and his unfortunate demise in the early parts of The Last of Us Part 2. This is clearly a subject which has undergone a massive amount of scrutiny and analysis. There are those who are adamant that killing off Joel was the worst idea possible. There are those who believe it was the next natural step in the story of The Last of Us. Finally, there's me. I think that killing off Joel was not necessary to shift the focus and progression of the narrative to Ellie. However, for the purposes of The Last of Us Part 2, I'll just say that I'm not upset with the decision to kill Joel off. There is a problem with how he is killed off. And no, it's not because Abby knocks a golf club-sized hole into his noggin. It's because Joel's execution and the events around it were, to put it frankly, not well executed by the writers. The entire lead up to Joel's death is littered with contrived drivel. Every major aspect of the setup or preceding events requires you to suspend all disbelief, pack that disbelief into an airtight container, and launch it hurling into the cold heart of space. Joel's death is literally laughable, considering how poorly it was handled. I know some people will just brush this off as me simply talking out of my rear end, so to illustrate for everyone how easy it is to rip apart the narrative structure of one of the game's most important sequences, I'll break it down point by point. Remember folks, the rule of the day is this: if the developer wants us, the players, to take their story and their world seriously, they need to take their writing and the logic of their characters seriously as well. It's a two-way street. Point 1. It's the apocalypse. Duh. The Last of Us Part 2 is trying to tell a very somber and provocative story about humanity while doing it in a very silly way. This is the root of a lot of the frustration with the plot and the characters within this game. Right out of the gate, the writers expect us to believe that not only would someone be willing to travel from Seattle, Washington to Jackson, Wyoming for something as petty as revenge in the middle of an apocalypse, but we also have to believe this person could convince all of her friends to drop their responsibilities and accompany her. It's not as simple as hopping in a car and driving into the next town. This is a major trip. Personally, the more logical scenario, given the world that they live in, would indicate the trip would be made on foot or horseback. However, we do briefly glimpse a truck of some kind in the garage of the house Abby's group is based at, outside of Jackson. So, the game might be trying to tell us that the group drove from Seattle to get there. Working under this assumption, we have to believe that Abby not only convinced her friends and or manipulated them into joining her, but that Isaac, who is shown to be very controlling and strict, actually allowed Abby and her friends, his glorified militia, to leave their posts and the state on a revenge quest, while simultaneously burning precious fuel and supplies on the trip to get there and back. This sounds dumb even as I'm saying it. Why would anyone take such risks and do such irresponsible things in an apocalypse? Especially since this is a world where everyone has lost someone close to them. Abby isn't special. Everyone else has lost someone or had someone they knew killed by infected or murdered by someone else. Abby's desire to seek revenge in this world is actually so dumb it kinda makes that part of the plot feel really silly. Almost like a parody. By the way, for those wondering, Jackson, Wyoming is over 800 miles away from Seattle. In real life, the most direct route via major roads is around 861 miles. I'm sure Abby probably attempted a more direct approach, so let's shave off about 20 or 30 miles. At 830 miles, a non-stop trip by vehicle at highway speeds would take between 10 to 12 hours. With it being the apocalypse, stops would be necessary to negotiate bandits, roadblocks, and infected. Thus, we will allow for the road trip to extend to roughly 2 to 3 days by vehicle. Including the return voyage to Seattle, that's 4 to 6 days of food and time away from WLF duty, using upwards of 1,600 miles worth of fuel. If the trip were by foot, the trip from Seattle would take between 15 and 17 days to reach Jackson, without stopping to sleep or eat or even take a bathroom break. Allowing for basic apocalypse conditions and basic human needs along the way, the trip would be extended to at minimum somewhere between 20 to 25 days to reach Jackson. this would mean a trip to Jackson and the return trip to Seattle by foot would roughly take 2 months worth of time and supplies. That's Abby and all of her friends from the militia off duty from the WLF for 2 months. There is the possibility of using horses for part of the journey. However, I'm not going to give the writers any credit on this one. The information I collected for you all, which I just mentioned, took me all of 10 minutes to figure out. Naughty Dog spent an estimated $100 million on the budget and the better part of 7 years on development. And you are trying to tell me no one realized how stupid the setup to this game sounded, even on paper? Before I can continue, I have to acknowledge that a criticism of my criticism would be that the first Last of Us game is actually based around a road trip from Boston to Jackson, and eventually to Salt Lake City. Yes, I understand that, and even with the context of the first game, it's still pretty weird. However, at least with the first game, Joel's journey with Ellie starts as him taking a job, where a form of bartering is happening. Joel is trading his services as a smuggler in exchange for goods he wants and needs for his own survival. Secondly, by the later parts of the game, it becomes clear that even though Joel suggests returning to Jackson, Ellie and even Joel acknowledge that after traveling this far, she deserves to know the truth about herself from the Fireflies. Obviously, everything goes wrong there at the end in Salt Lake City, but the distinction between the motivations and how they are relative to each game differ enormously. The first game's rationale simply makes more sense. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that this game is supposed to be a work of art and an example of great storytelling in gaming. As a player, you shouldn't be expected to take a story seriously while simultaneously shutting your brain off whenever the story conveniently forgets the state of the world it's set in. Point number 2. It just so happens. So let's say you're willing to overlook all of that stuff I just mentioned. There are still many more contrived elements to dissect from Joel's farewell tour. The next of these is actually really stupid. Once again, the writers expect us to believe that Abby just so happens to venture outside the group's camp with Owen, followed up by having a fight with Owen, and finally followed up by her deciding in a fit of agitation to take off on her own. She does this because only now, after the entire trip, she and Owen decide to have a conversation regarding the risk factors of trying to pull off a revenge-based assassination mission in and around a settlement filled with potential hostiles. She doesn't like his cautious perspective of the situation, or that he refuses to blindly coerce the others to follow her into the fray of her impetuous aggression.
What is going on with you?
Mel's pregnant.
Oh. Okay.
It's not just that, though.
Should I say congrats?
When everyone else sees this, they're gonna want to turn back.
We can convince him, right? I knew I couldn't count on you.
Abby, I want what you want, but not at any cost.
So, she does what any good character would do. She goes it alone, out of irritation. I wonder if she'll magically bump into any conveniently placed characters. Point number 3. It just so happens again. Continuing on from the last contrived excuse for plot progression, Abby just so happens to be traversing the same hills, which are that exact day experiencing a visit from a roving horde of infected amidst their migration to the next cutscene. It also just so happens that there's a snowstorm at that exact same time, clearly in no way designed to make the situation extra dire and cinematic. Wow, what a perfect storm of coincidences for our new character to encounter. It would be extremely bizarre and unfortunate if she got herself into a really bad situation. Abby might actually end up at a location where she could come across 2 strapping brothers from Jackson, who are conveniently on patrol at the exact same time there's a storm, a horde of infected to chase them, and a revenge-crazed She-Hulk looking to beat one of their heads in with a golf club. Point number 4. It just so happens 3 times. If you still think the events leading to Joel's death make sense, Don't forget, there's always room for more contrivances in this story. After a progressively head-scratching series of conveniences take place, Joel and Tommy are there to save the girl who just so happens to be looking for them and who just so happens to have been chased to their location by a horde who just so happened to be there on the exact same day when the two brothers just so happened to be outside of Jackson. To top this off, the snowstorm and infected just so happened to force Joel and Tommy to follow Abby to the very place where her friends are located at, leaving the two of them cornered and at the mercy of the group who actually wants Joel dead. Yeah, that's a big stinking load of lazy, contrived writing if I've ever seen it. The weirdest part is this is the moment which serves as the death of the previous game's main protagonist, and for all intent and purposes, the catalyst for most of the second game's plot. You want me to believe this is the best they could come up with? To say that Joel dying was a good idea is perfectly fine. To say that Joel's death makes sense is arrogant to say the least. I'm fine with killing off a character, even Joel, but at least be smart about it. This ending for Joel was just plain insulting. Now that you understand my thoughts on Joel's demise, we can focus on a rundown of its two main protagonists, a girl named Ellie and a girl named Abby. The moment of truth has come at last. It's time to discuss the two protagonists of The Last of Us Part 2. This game relies heavily, and I really do mean heavily, on the concept of duality. The writers decided to hammer home, in every way imaginable, the idea that Abby's story and Ellie's story aren't so different after all. That, at the end of the day, they've each seen and experienced tragedy and loss. Thus, when it comes to trying to figure out which character is in the right, or which character is in the wrong, players can't simply point and say, oh, this character over here, that's the bad one, and the other one's the good one. The two ladies are equally flawed throughout the course of the game, with each making mistakes they probably would want to take back. I'm not being funny when I say this, but why do we need to focus so much time on Abby and Ellie's flaws, especially with regard to The Last of Us Part 2's story? The writers must have forgotten what kind of world they were setting the story in. This world has already been established as a place where we see the absolute worst of humanity on display. We've already understood that everyone has done messed up stuff in this world. Every person is equally capable of darkness given the right situation. It's fine to have flawed characters, but in many ways Part 2's narrative forces the characters of Ellie and Abby to be unrealistic at times when they don't have to be at all. Beyond this, there are a number of other odd choices specific to each of the two leading ladies. Looking at one specific case, I can refer to the bizarre decision to properly introduce players to Abby and her friends long after they've already murdered the protagonist of the previous game. My problem with this lies mostly in the idea that the player isn't motivated to care about the WLF characters in the beginning. When we first see them, we aren't given a true introduction. Abby is just thrust into the spotlight with a bunch of other characters whom we've never met before. Before we even get to really know anything about Abby, except the fact that she's looking for someone, the WLF group manages to detain and torture Joel, ultimately killing him. While I understand there are people who went on to actually like and appreciate these newer characters later in the game, I'm afraid I wasn't able to really find a reason to care, despite giving the game every opportunity to make me do so. Essentially, having Abby kill Joel 10 hours before we get to spend time learning anything about her or the WLF was the stupidest thing they could have done in this game. But let's not dwell on that right now. It's time to talk some broad strokes for a moment. Obviously, it's apparent by now that I dislike the storytelling and execution of the narrative overall. Why is that though? I mean, there are people who swear by this game and think it's a misunderstood masterpiece. What did I see that they didn't? I think the answer to that question lies in the many individual sequences which might have gotten a pass from others, but I found to be lacking depth or even sense. The game is full of cutscenes and story beats intended to keep the narrative going as much as possible, whenever possible. Such is the case with any story-driven game like The Last of Us Part 2. However, There is a tendency for some of these cutscenes and moments, many of which are intended to feel quite cinematic or edge of your seat, to be overly convenient or contrived. There are multiple instances of scenes where imminent danger is threatening one of our protagonists, only for something or someone to happen along and allow a protagonist to escape the situation.
Jesse, stand up! Hands in the air, I shoot this one too.
Don't you do it, Ellie. Get out of here.
Stand up! Now! Stop! Toss your weapon.
Shoot her! Shoot her! Shoot her! Shoot her!
Don't ever let me see you again. Come on.
Shoot her! Shoot her!
These are the same kind of scenes you find in cheesy action films. Why is it okay for The Last of Us Part 2 to do these things and be considered great storytelling? When an action movie uses the exact same tropes, we jokingly say, you just have to shut your brain off and treat it like a fun popcorn flick. We don't say this with The Last of Us Part 2. We are asked to pretend it's a narrative achievement in gaming. This type of double standard is frustrating to me. Another problem within The Last of Us Part 2 is the inconsistency of Ellie and Abby throughout their respective sections. An often pointed to and glaring example of this can be found with the cutscene depicting Ellie suffering from the trauma she developed from beating Nora for information about Abby. This sequence is played up with a heavy emphasis on the psychological and emotional repercussions of inflicting that level of violence upon someone. Ellie appears in a state of shock as Dina attempts to comfort her. The scene on its own is not necessarily the issue, but it does become one with the proper context. To clarify, before playing this game, I wanted to get a sense of what both sides of the conversation had to say about it. So I took to the internet and perused the forums and comments sections, and any such place where people were sharing opinions about why they either liked or disliked the game. One point, which I found to be a constant among the defenders of Part 2, was a frustration with the critique of this particular scene with Ellie. Specifically, they were quite adamant that the game properly builds up Ellie's trauma and shock to lead to this point. Not only that, they felt certain that the gameplay sections as a whole adequately showcased the evidence for them to simply infer Ellie's mental and emotional state throughout the game. Therefore, criticisms suggesting otherwise should be rendered invalid. I decided to keep this in mind as I played to see if Ellie's attitudes and mood shifts were consistent and set up properly as the people online suggested they would be. Well, folks, I'm here to say that this is simply not the case.
Took out your friend!
There is a distinct difference in the way Ellie reacts during gameplay to killing people versus how she reacts to it within the cutscenes. The levels leading to this very scene, where Ellie confides in Dina about what she did, don't blend with the cutscene itself. It actively makes me question why Ellie is reacting this way. There is simply no focus on Ellie having a sense of remorse in the moment, only later, when it conveniently serves the story the writers are trying to tell. This is a journey Ellie is undertaking, and it's a long and difficult one. If she could find the motivation to travel by horse from Jackson to Seattle, seeking revenge for Joel's murder, why would Ellie not have the strength or even the drive to kill the people who actually participated in Joel's capture and death? Ellie doesn't indicate she's bothered by wiping out a group of 10 WLF soldiers and scouts because, well, they were trying to kill her or were simply an obstacle in her path. I don't like the insinuation that basic rules of kill or be killed are an explanation for a lack of feeling regarding these people's deaths. Those scouts, who were merely on patrol, they didn't kill Joel. However, it's the characters who did whom Ellie decides to feel conflicted about. Why? It's because they're the main supporting cast, and not some random combat NPCs. There could be an argument the journey of revenge was more so a journey of trying to seek closure or resolution, and everyone else she hurt or killed was merely collateral damage along the way. But honestly, even on paper, that sounds really stupid. The whole situation feels off because of the inconsistencies with the writing. Another thing which really didn't work for me was the way Naughty Dog handled the subplot surrounding Joel's actions at the end of the first game. While the first game elected to make it ambiguous as to whether Ellie believed Joel's lie in the final scene, this game retcons it so that she did believe his lie, but ended up finding out the truth later on her own. I really disagreed with the way they handled some of the dialogue and character interactions in these crucial story beats. In the first scene where this conflict properly arises, Ellie exits the hospital in Salt Lake City, having returned on her own looking for answers. She encounters Joel not long after exiting the building. When he arrives, a brief reunion is quickly crushed by Ellie calling Joel out on his choice to lie to her and for his actions. She feels somehow disenfranchised, or perhaps robbed of something she could have had, if not for him. To be honest, I couldn't sympathize with Ellie here, because the first game spent the entire length of the story setting up a strong connection, a bond between Joel and Ellie. This bond extended to the point of them filling surrogate roles for each other. Joel became the surrogate father and Ellie became the surrogate daughter. This is the dynamic The Last of Us 1 chose to set up. The one it chose to focus an entire narrative around. As a player, I bought into the message and themes and narrative setup of the first game. So someone please explain to me why I'm supposed to care that Ellie is acting like an angsty teenager and completely prepared to sever her relationship with Joel because he chose to save her life. In doing so, he was giving her the opportunity to find her own way, to choose her own path as she grew up in an environment of friends and loved ones. I'm referring to Jackson here. This was something his own daughter Sarah never had the chance to do. When Joel understood that the Fireflies were going to sacrifice her life for a potential cure, he did what any father would do. He protected his child. Ellie's life was in danger. Being a father is an important responsibility. There are sacrifices you have to make and burdens you must bear for your kids. But above everything else, a father's first duty is to protect and care for his child. Joel acted in this role during the ending of The Last of Us. He risked his life to save her. He bore the burden of guilt for what happened so she wouldn't have to. Joel did what fathers must do. And what does he get for his trouble? A threat of estrangement from the girl he saved because how dare he protect his surrogate daughter? Joel should have just left her to die on the operating table. At least, that's how Ellie makes it sound.
I'm not trying to.
I was supposed to die in that hospital. My life would have fucking mattered. But you took that from me.
Ellie basically judges Joel for his actions and his attempts to keep the truth from her. What Joel did was the hard choice, the difficult one to make, but it was one a father must make. There is an argument to be made that Joel should have told her the truth, but he wanted to spare her any guilt she might have had because of it. Why? Gee, if only there was a reason. Oh yeah, that's right, because he loves her like she was his own.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
I'll say it again. Fathers make sacrifices and fathers will bear burdens for their children. Unfortunately, Ellie doesn't want Joel to act like a father would act. She wants him to let her get killed so her brain bacteria can be used to develop a cure. Based on the information Part 2's story provides, it really does appear as though Ellie has something of a savior complex. Apparently, simply living a good life isn't good enough. No, she has to die for a vaccine in order for her life to matter or mean anything. Give me a freaking break. It's ridiculous sounding and juvenile. It's already bad enough that Ellie overreacts the way she does. Her reaction and treatment of Joel over everything he's done for her don't endear me to her point of view.
Worry about yourself.
Let's get you some fresh air.
You alright, kiddo?
What is wrong with you?
He had no right.
And you do? I don't need your
help, Joel.
Right.
More than anything, it felt like an entitled and arrogant stance from someone who has never been put in that situation before. Gee, I wonder why she never got to experience that choice to begin with. It's probably because the Fireflies never gave it to her. They conveniently forgot to ask her permission to kill her before putting her under anesthesia. I'm not saying Ellie isn't allowed to be mad about Joel lying. I'm not saying there's only one way to see the situation. What I'm saying is, why did they have to write these scenes in such a weird fashion? The dialogue feels like it's rushed and unfinished. The characters really only talk about it for like 3 scenes out of the whole game. 3 stinking scenes, and that's all she wrote for this subplot. Hope you guys enjoyed the conclusion to a story thread that was left dangling in the air since 2013. It's covered in this game shockingly quick, and doesn't receive much polish. Though to be fair to the writers and the game's story, The Last of Us Part 2 has such a bloated narrative that they probably didn't have the time to address this issue with the gravitas it truly deserved. There's a recurrence in The Last of Us Part 2, that being situations and character interactions that often feel inauthentic or outright forced. The conflict between Joel and Ellie is an important one within the world of The Last of Us, but the way it was handled was pretty disappointing and ultimately lackluster. A big shift from the first game to the second comes from the lack of a character dynamic that is as compelling as the one the first game provided. Make no mistake, Ellie is still able to shine in certain moments of Part 2 as an evolved version of the same character we met in the first one. The consistent issue with Ellie's journey is, for the most part, the lack of intriguing character interactions on her journey. It's not that there isn't an attempt at carrying over the little individual character moments we fell in love with in The Last of Us 1, it's just that there's a notable difference. For most of the early parts in Ellie's chunk of the story, she is accompanied by Dina. Though Dina is not a bad character and actually has some good moments throughout the game, the back and forth of Ellie and Dina doesn't give me the same satisfaction as Joel and Ellie together did. Maybe it's something about seeing 2 characters sharing flirtatious and lighthearted dialogue shortly after the death of Joel, and while they are on a revenge mission in hostile territory, which feels incredibly off to me, and possibly out of place. Now, don't get me wrong. There are good moments of banter between the 2 sprinkled throughout, but the timing and circumstances feel slightly awkward when it comes to some of their dialogue. Basically, coming from Joel and Ellie's strong emotional journey to getting CW-inspired morsels of Ellie and Dina's romantic drama is an Ubisoft-level downgrade. Although, to be honest, we do get some great character beats from Jesse and Ellie as they join up for a small portion of her saga. It's these little tidbits with Jesse which really provide the goods the writers didn't deliver with Dina and Ellie. There are several other things about Ellie's character in this game which bothered me, but I think it's time we shared the spotlight with Abby a little bit. After all, she is the second main character of the story. Not unlike Ellie, little orphan Abby has some aspects of her character which really annoyed me as I played through the narrative of this game. The first of these was the attitude and almost selfish arrogance with which Abby carries herself in certain sequences of the game. Stuff like this can be a real nail in the coffin for an audience trying to sympathize with the character. In my case, it wasn't exactly a death toll for Abby, but it definitely didn't endear me toward her. Moreover, Abby feels like a character who uses people for what she wants and doesn't consider the consequences. Not to mention her complete lack of concern for her actions, especially in reference to events like Abby convincing her friends to accompany her on a revenge quest for Joel, and her deciding to sleep with Owen behind Mel's back. By involving her friends in the killing of Joel, she was also knowingly getting them involved in any retaliation that would follow. In this case, Ellie killing most of them later in the game. Secondly, Abby decides, rather oddly, to do the deed with Owen on his boat, despite knowing that he is expecting a child with the pregnant Mel, his current girlfriend. Not that Owen is free from blame here, but we're not discussing Owen right now. Abby does some good things in this game, to be sure. She goes after Owen when it appears he is in a bad situation, even though she knows she probably shouldn't. She sticks with Lev and assists Lev and Yara despite the differences between those two and herself. She is not an entirely good or an entirely bad person. But the real problem with Abby as a main character in this game is a pretty big one. Why should I care about her character growth 10 hours after she murdered my favorite character in the franchise? Maybe that seems cold to some of you, but consider how cold and unfeeling Abby was in the hospital with her dad, as he was deciding to operate on Ellie. Instead of sitting back and letting the adults handle the big debate about murder, a teenage Abby encourages her father to go through with the procedure. Her reasoning is that if Abby herself was the young girl with the brain bacteria, she would wish to be sacrificed in order to potentially save the world. Whether or not Ellie would have said yes is irrelevant. Abby is in no position to speak on behalf of someone else's life, let alone to do so in such a cavalier fashion. I found this scene to be incredibly cold and inhuman of her. Remember this scene because we'll be coming back to it later, folks. The trouble with The Last of Us Part 2 and how it handles its two protagonists comes down to pacing and execution. Ironically, the two biggest problems with the game overall. Abby's story is too big for its own good, and after everything's said and done, it feels as though her father's death and the subsequent killing of Joel are of relatively minor importance to her personal narrative. Abby's faction, the WLF, is caught up in a war with a cult-like faction known as the Seraphites, or Scars as the WLF calls them. During this time, Ellie is in the process of making the journey to Seattle and tracking down the WLF members who were responsible for Joel's death. The game's narrative is split into two perspectives, which for the most part take place across the same 3 days. Abby's time is divided into 3 major chunks. The first 2 chunks have her traveling with Manny and pregnant Mel, and later going AWOL and searching for Owen. Mixed within these chapters are several flashbacks showcasing young Abby and her dad, as well as young Abby and young Owen. The third chunk of time is spent on Abby getting captured by Seraphites, but immediately being rescued by the appearance of Lev and Yara. After sharing an escape sequence with them, there is a short break before Abby returns to help them. Abby's story suddenly then shifts to become a weird quasi-rehash of The Last of Us 1's story of Joel guiding Ellie on her path. Abby becomes the guide for Lev and Yara on their journey, though specifically for Lev in actuality. This sudden change in direction for Abby is pretty awkward to say the least. As a player, I was still waiting on the game to follow through with many of the subplots already going on at this point. Mel and Owen, and all of the drama surrounding those two, is only loosely addressed in the rest of the narrative, before they are promptly killed off. Manny is really just a glorified comedic sidekick whose claim to fame is spitting on Joel. The WLF and Seraphite War is pushed to the front of the narrative, then almost immediately pushed into the background, as it barely adds anything meaningful to the story by the end. Abby's entire direction in this narrative boils down to being the guardian for 2 kids whom she barely knows. She met them and decided they were her mission in life after mere hours, right in the midst of sleeping with Owen. The WLF doesn't matter. The war, the Seraphites, the dad killer, the Manny, the Mel, the Owen, the Nora, and the Isaac, none of it matters once Abby meets Lev. Lev essentially becomes the driving force of the story towards the end. Thus, all of Abby's resolutions with the other characters have to be force-fed into the marina sequence before Abby leaves. A last scene with Mel before they part ways is a nice addition, but doesn't quite feel like a proper resolution to the conflict between Owen, Mel, and Abby, which has been brewing pretty nicely at this point. Truth be told, we really don't get any sort of finality to the subplot, just as there's no final wrap-up on many of the other subplots running wild in Abby's 10 to 15 hour section of the game. There's also an attempt at an emotional farewell scene with Alice, the dog, as the game provides you an opportunity to throw the ball around with her for a bit. This is a cool sequence, but it didn't make me feel bad for having killed the dog earlier in the game when I was playing as Ellie. It felt like it was trying to guilt trip me, but I'm not certain if that was what the writers were actually going for. It's kind of weird. There will be people who love and applaud this game for its characters and story. Those people are free to enjoy these characters and this narrative, but they can't convince me that the writing or the story in this game is good. It's painfully average at its absolute best. There is one more thing I want to cover before I move on from Abby. That topic is Abby's motivation for wanting Joel dead and the flashback sequence to her time at the hospital with her father. I told you all we'd come back to this later. Well, here we are. The The main factor in the beginning of Abby's narrative arc is the death of her father, whom Joel killed to save Ellie. Obviously, Abby only sees this as the murder of her father, and becomes overwhelmed by grief. After several years, Abby is able to locate Joel's whereabouts. She promptly hunts him down and kills him. Naturally, after seeing the other side of the equation, we're supposed to feel empathy for Abby, because she lost her father. It's something anyone would feel sad about and relate to. Except, I don't really feel bad for killing her dad in the first game. You might be wondering why I feel this way, or why I have no empathy for Abby in this situation. Well, let's look at how wonderful her daddy really is. See, Abby's dad is the doctor who is going to operate on Ellie to remove the brain bacteria for his proposed cure. We're introduced to him in The Last of Us Part 2 in a sequence with an injured zebra, where he helps the animal free alongside Abby. We're supposed to feel a sense of warmth toward him. Even if you do at first, that warmth will be ripped away when you realize this dude is perfectly fine with sacrificing a young girl's life, in this case, Ellie's life. I want to take a moment and briefly segue to set up a point I have regarding this whole situation. I wonder if many of you have ever seen The Walking Dead TV show or read The Walking Dead comics. There's a character in both the comics and the show who is actually my favorite of all the ones in The Walking Dead. His name is the Governor. The Governor is the best apocalyptic villain I've ever encountered in any such type of media. He is ruthless and sadistic to the bone. But why is he such a cold-hearted and ruthless son of a gun? The Governor believes in a vision of the future for the community he oversees. He believes with every fiber of his being that he will be the man to lead these people through the dark and horrific world in The Walking Dead and see them through to salvation, in a non-biblical sense. Due to having such a powerful belief in this vision and the conviction in his plans, the Governor utilizes a warped and twisted form of moral philosophy to justify killing anyone or doing anything to protect Woodbury or his vision. Anything that threatens him is simply seen as an act of disposing of someone or something as a means to an end. To the Governor, the ends justify the means. He really is a warped and sadistic character, one of the reasons he makes a perfect villain in The Walking Dead. Now you might ask how this is relevant to my discussion of Abby and her father. Well, Abby's dad is doing the exact same thing with Ellie that the Governor does with his obstacles. Abby's dad is using a warped and twisted moral philosophy to justify killing Ellie for the greater good. Remember folks, it doesn't matter if Ellie would have been okay with it or not, because they drugged her and sedated her before she could say no. They weren't sure she would say yes, so they took her choice from her. Abby's dad believes so much in his vision for what the Fireflies could be, for the redemption they could all have due to the bad things they've all had to do or endure, that he is willing to murder a little girl for the greater good. Ellie's death is simply a means to an end. So do I feel bad for Abby losing her father? No, I don't, because they made Abby's father easily one of the most unlikable characters in the story.
Is he still in the building? Abby.
No!
Abby, don't look.
Dad! Daddy, no!
Daddy, yes!
It also doesn't help that he's voiced by the same dude who plays Mr. Jefferson in Life is Strange, a character who literally drugs young girls, kidnaps them, and takes photos of them in an underground bunker. That's not The Last of Us Part 2's fault, but I've got to admit, it was stuck in the back of my mind the whole time that her dad was on the screen. As I mentioned at the start of this chapter, The Last of Us Part 2 focuses heavily on the concept of duality when it comes to Abby and Ellie. The game attempts to utilize a split protagonist approach to accomplish the execution of this concept. The big problem with doing this is that trying to pull off a split protagonist narrative can be really stinking difficult in a video game. This difficulty arises from the issue of pacing within the story. In some cases, like The Last of Us Part 2, having split protagonists creates an issue with allowing characters enough time to develop naturally. To some extent, the stop and starts of a character's story can fight against the narrative itself, creating an uneven tone or more pacing problems. So my point with saying all this is that the execution by the writers and creators has to be spot on and precise if they're going to have a split protagonist narrative. Within The Last of Us Part 2, we have two distinct underlying faults which helped to cripple the story more than it should have been. The first of these is the uneven and sometimes poor choices of when to cut back and forth between playing as Ellie and playing as Abby. There are times when you feel like you're finally getting into the rhythm with the character or the story, and whoosh, you're ripped away to play as another character. Then later in the game, flip-flopping comes to a grinding halt when you play for 10 or so hours as Ellie before playing another 10 or so hours as Abby, after which the game cuts back to flip-flopping character switches for the rest of the game. It's incredibly uneven, and quite frankly, it was incredibly annoying. Though I know why these choices were made, the attempts to hone in on duality so much ultimately did a disservice to the story. The forceful focus on both Abby and Ellie feeling spiritually connected to each other and not being dissimilar from the other put an emphasis on both of them having parallels. Ellie and Abby both lose a father and seek revenge for these deaths. Ellie and Abby both have someone close to them who is pregnant and gets put in dangerous situations that threaten both themselves and their unborn child. In Ellie's case, it's Dina, who left to help Ellie on her quest, but didn't know for sure if she was pregnant or not. With Abby, it's Mel, who is pregnant with Owen's baby, which causes a lot of problems with an awkward love triangle. Abby and Ellie both have a friend that helps them on their journey, who essentially acts as a comedic relief or lighthearted companion for the respective protagonist. These friends each die quite suddenly while being shot through the head as they attempt to burst through a doorway. I'm speaking of Manny and Jesse, who are both killed in a jump scare sort of fashion. Additionally, we see Owen and Abby have a shared peaceful moment with a seal in the aquarium, which harkens back to the giraffe scene from the first game with Joel and Ellie. Abby's relationship to Lev is very much meant to draw comparisons with Joel and Ellie's relationship in the first game. They even replicated the same shot of Joel and Ellie driving in the truck, with Abby and Lev riding in the boat. As you can see, Duality is the name of the game. It is perhaps a tad overwhelming to the point of feeling overdone. I mean, I wasn't kidding when I mentioned the whole two of everything bit in the chapter heading. The entire game focuses on what it means to experience trauma, sorrow, anguish, pain, loss, and the aftermath of dealing with those things. Both Abby and Ellie are shown to be struggling with processing these feelings and their own reactions to the experiences that led to them. We didn't need an overblown series of parallels to tell us this. There were already enough context clues to tell us the important pieces of the underlying story threads. I'm not outright saying the duality idea didn't work in every respect, but there was too much focus on it. What the game needed more than anything was a more concise narrative direction for both Ellie's and Abby's character progression. Far too much was going on in the game anyway. But to have all these added layers on top of that sort of messed with the story more than it should have. At this point, you're probably wondering if there was anything I liked about Ellie or Abby and their respective stories within The Last of Us Part 2. Surprise, surprise, I did like some of the things about each character, and certain moments within each of their narrative arcs. With Ellie, I really enjoyed some of the little moments between her and the supporting character she hangs out with in multiple sections of the game. There are bright spots with Dina which actually work fairly well, like the scene at the bottom of the record shop. It's not going to win any writing awards, but it felt like it fit the game fine enough.
We're starting a band. How about you be my groupie?
Your what?
Well, okay. Bands apparently had these hardcore fans that would just follow them around.
Isn't that what I'm already doing?
I guess so.
Even though Jesse's reappearance after Ellie's big shootout is beyond ridiculous given the situation, I loved every second of the gameplay and story scenes he shared with Ellie. Jesse provides a nice change of pace from what we got with Dina. I'm not going to suggest Dina's time as your traveling companion was a bad decision. However, as I mentioned earlier, I just didn't get into some of the conversations between Ellie and Dina. While the two characters are overall mostly decent together, I did feel like Jesse added a little more substance, even for such a short time with Ellie. Of course, it only makes sense as Jesse is easily the most consistent and arguably the best written character in the game. He's likable from beginning to end. He adds warmth, personality, and even some lighthearted moments at relatively appropriate spots. He simply is the best character in the game, given the miscues and character mistakes made with the two main characters.
Couldn't have said it better.
Oh, hello. Sorry, the dinosaurs are busy right now.
What are you doing?
Oh, wait. One of the dinosaurs is here.
Got her! We're not going back, understand?
Follow me!
The Last of Us Part 2 really tries to make its jumbled and bloated narrative work, but when it doesn't, the game fractures and a lot of loose pieces spill out into the open. So I decided to share with you some of those pieces which really hurt the overall experience. The first of these miscues is the subplot following the WLF, aka the Washington Liberation Front. I was really interested in the whole conflict between them and the Seraphites, but goodness gracious, even I couldn't have predicted how wildly out of control this arc eventually got. After the first 10 to 13 hours of play, players take control of Abby as the new playable character. This is the beginning of one of her many arcs, and consequently the WLF subplot. As it begins, we get a chance to see them in their element, much like we were introduced to the Jackson community at the beginning of the game. It doesn't take long before there's an ambush on Abby and her friends. Here, we get to see what a militia-scale war of attrition would look like in an apocalypse. After enough time has passed, players meet Isaac, the leader of the WLF. Abby finds out that Owen is responsible for the death of another member of the group, a guy named Danny.
Isn't that body bag?
It's Danny.
Why we sent a search party after him?
He shot Danny. Apparently to protect some scar.
Now, despite all of the interesting lead-ins and world building, the WLF subplot magically drops out of focus just as it starts heating up. We don't see Isaac again until practically the end of the game, where he is promptly killed off along with any chance of revisiting the best part of Abby's plotline. As it stands, Abby's storyline in the game has too many detours and ducks in and out of connecting itself to Ellie's story. There is no balance. And unfortunately, all of the cool stuff surrounding the war between the Scars and the WLF is largely left at the wayside. This wasn't the worst thing in the game, but setting up a really interesting conflict before ultimately just throwing it into the background and only tangentially using it at all felt like it was ultimately just a big waste. In the latter parts of Ellie's playable section before switching to Abby, Ellie and Jesse part ways. as Jesse decides to focus on locating Tommy. Ellie continues her pursuit of Abby and heads for the marina. What follows is a fun trek through the apocalyptic waterways of Seattle. This level has the player, as Ellie, traverse what feels like a quarter of the city to reach the coastline where the marina is located. She does this by boat for the most part. She is free to stop at some locations along her way or continue her pursuit. Either way, it's a long way from where she was to where she ends up. Once she arrives at the marina, she almost immediately confronts Mel and Owen as to the whereabouts of Abby. As the scene unfolds, Mel and Owen end up dead. Out of nowhere, as Ellie starts to have a nervous breakdown, Tommy and Jesse just show up to get Ellie and take her away. How in the heck could Jesse have reached Tommy, and the two of them made it all the way back over to the marina in time to reach Ellie mere moments after she killed Mel and Owen? We see Jesse and Ellie going in two different directions as they leave in search of Tommy and Abby respectively. It takes maybe 7 or 8 minutes after arriving at the marina for Ellie to find Mel and Owen. This game expects me to believe that Jesse left Ellie and found Tommy within 5 to 7 minutes before making the same excruciatingly long trek across the water and rapids in record speed to reach Ellie less than 10 minutes after she arrived. Not to mention that the area that Jesse goes looking for Tommy is in the opposite direction from where we last saw him, because if you recall, later in the game when we're playing through Abby's section, although chronologically set before the sequence of the game, has Tommy falling over the edge of a pier. It's a bad idea on paper and a worse idea on screen. The worst part of it is, it was likely included so Ellie would get pulled away from the marina before she had a chance to notice her map lying on the floor, with the group's exact location marked on it plain as day. Surely it will not play an important role later when another character needs to conveniently learn of Ellie's whereabouts. The Santa Barbara sequence at the end of the game is going to get some representation in this chapter because we have not one, but 2 different miscues associated with it. For starters, we'll talk about the Rattlers. This is a faction which is introduced late into the game when Abby reaches Santa Barbara with Lev. The major problem with having a new faction pop up this late in the story is that there is no proper build-up. Who are they? What are their motivations and goals? Do they encounter any rival factions or resistance from others in their region? Who is the leader of their group? Why are they even in this game? These are among the most important questions one could ask about the Rattlers in their last-minute debut. The only thing we know for certain is that the Rattlers capture people and use them for slave labor. They appear out of nowhere, and I think for a lot of people, their introduction feels like the start of a completely different game. It didn't help that the story was, once again, adding something else to wrap your head around. I probably would have found the Rattlers more interesting if they weren't limited to less than 90 minutes of the game. I wouldn't be surprised if this ending scenario in Santa Barbara actually turned out to be some sort of rewrite made late in the development cycle. It really does have that kind of feeling about it. The actual gameplay experience with the Rattlers is really cool and a whole lot of fun, but that doesn't stop it from being out of place in a story that already struggles to find its focus. Santa Barbara and the Rattlers feel more like a DLC for the game than an actual ending to it. I've already treaded this ground before in an earlier chapter discussing my problems with how Joel's death was handled. However, I'm not going to hold back my criticism because of a little deja vu. As long as The Last of Us Part 2 insists on pursuing the absolute luxury of revenge in the middle of an apocalypse over hundreds and hundreds of miles of terrain, I will continue to point out how ridiculous it is. Unlike a trip from Jackson, Wyoming to Seattle, Washington, the trek to Santa Barbara for the third act is pushing north of 1,000 miles worth of a cross-country expedition. We're talking nearly 2 months of time to reach it by foot, or slightly less if traveling part of the way by horse. This is once again citing the same situation as I covered before, with basic survival needs in apocalypse conditions. The believability of a story is really hindered when you have scenarios like this pop up in your narrative. I get it. We have to accept some things, otherwise the story wouldn't exist. However, the act of venturing for a month and a half across 1,000 plus miles of hostile, unforgiving countryside so Ellie can learn to let go of what happened and move on with her life is a fairly ridiculous ask. I mean, if I'm being absolutely generous here, let's say Ellie was able to make the trip at walking speed without sleeping, eating, or even stopping for a trip to the ladies' room. In this case, we're looking at a trip length of approximately 22.5 days to arrive and 45 days round trip. Stuff like this doesn't help make a game immersive or believable. It simply adds onto a running list of problems that begin to pile up and weigh the narrative down dramatically. This one might not bother some, but it really bothered me. Due to the narrative trying to really push for a duality between Abby and Ellie, we get two pregnant women caught dead center in the middle of some really bad situations. At least the game sort of attempts to excuse Dina's situation, having her explain how she wasn't even certain whether she was pregnant or not before venturing out on the revenge quest with Ellie, helped make it less odd on the whole. Unfortunately, the writers didn't even try to make excuses for Mel. She actually has a full-blown pregnant baby belly going on as she signs up for missions in areas where Seraphite activity has been resurging. Even later on, we see tents full of wounded and dead bodies from all the people killed due to the scars breaking the peace. It may not be a war zone out there, but it is literally the apocalypse. Not to mention a radical faction of zealots is attacking, ambushing, and killing people from your faction every day. It makes no sense for a woman who is this pregnant to risk going out into the wild, where anything could happen. Mothers are constantly overprotective of their children, hence the expression we hear so often about the power of a mother's love and whatnot. Clearly the writing team didn't think beyond, hey, wouldn't it be cool to have a pregnant person in Abby's life and a pregnant person in Ellie's life so we can contrast them in the story? Also, a strong, independent woman who is pregnant wants to remind you she is strong and independent while making her own choices. Yeah, she can be strong and independent, all right. Simultaneously, she can also look like an idiot and make dumb decisions which endanger her unborn child to a wild degree. Being a strong female character and a smart female character are not interdependently linked in a concomitant manner. Why are so many characters put in life-threatening circumstances only to have something contrived happen to save them? This is the part where a story will start to lose my investment. The point of creating tension is to have the audience, or in this case the player, feel like the characters are in danger. Anyone could be expendable, and for that matter, there's a dramatic sense of weight applied to the dire situations the characters face. Thus, when the writers decide to put a protagonist in an extremely hazardous situation, something wild or outlandish will always occur to allow an escape. Why? What's the point of creating fake tension in a story like this? What happens when you set expectations for the player where they essentially know you aren't going to do anything remotely close to killing either of your main characters? I'm not even suggesting either character should have been killed off, but for goodness sake, stop throwing your protagonist into scenarios where they should be dying and they only make it out by sheer luck. With Ellie and Dina, the two are riding on horseback before they get ambushed and separated. Ellie is almost immediately captured and ends up being held in some sort of school building. We learn that WLF are conducting an extensive search for Dina within the local vicinity. The two militia guards argue over whether they should obey orders and kill Ellie or interrogate her for information about the imaginary force the two were clearly a part of when entering Seattle. This argument is sort of stupid because the head leader of the entire WLF actually orders them to kill this seemingly insignificant stranger. However, later in the story, we see WLF militia display willingness to, without question, immediately arrest Abby at the hospital on Isaac's orders. They don't even bother asking her why she was AWOL to begin with. But when it comes to a total stranger like Ellie, one of them conveniently questions the direct order from Isaac to execute Ellie because something doesn't seem right about it. That kind of stuff doesn't add up to me. Let's not forget, Dina just so happens to show up at the exact moment to take a shot at the dude who is about to kill Ellie. We heard the two mention there was a big search party out in the surroundings combing the area for Dina. How did she manage to avoid being spotted by all of those people in order to conveniently find the exact spot where Ellie was being held, in the exact moment she was about to be killed? That's a great question, which the game isn't concerned with answering or even addressing. The ending of this game is great from a pure gameplay perspective. The reason why it falls short of a satisfying conclusion despite all of the amazing set dressing, is largely due to the writers once again losing focus of what the story required. The Last of Us Part 2 is the inverse of the first one. While The Last of Us focused on hope, redemption, and the power of human connection in the face of a bleak, unforgiving world, The Last of Us Part 2 is about sorrow, suffering, grief, the pain of loss, and the emotional and psychological repercussions of such a devastating loss. In a story with themes like this, the character's growth should be determined by their ability to deal with the aforementioned emotional weight. Thus, to have a character arc, the protagonist must grow or learn something from the story in a meaningful or impactful way. The Last of Us Part 2 has Ellie travel all the way to Santa Barbara to confront Abby in the moment where we realize Ellie only wants closure and truly doesn't want to kill Abby is at the exact moment where she is choking her underwater. There's a brief glimpse of Joel in Ellie's mind that clue in the audience as to what's going through her thoughts. But ultimately, the way it was handled was pretty disappointing. Anyway, the point of the ending and the way the story wraps up just don't feel like they fit the game I just finished. They feel like a mid-season finale for a TV show where half of the story is still waiting to be told. In a way, this actually might make sense given how it becomes abundantly clear that Abby and Lev are literally sequel baiting the crap out of The Last of Us Part 2's conclusion. The resolutions offered are a poor excuse for an ending to the themes and narrative threads players will have experienced throughout the game up to that point. Like much of this game's story, the ending is a whole lot of show without a lot of substance. There's a sense of protection and forgiveness which surrounds The Last of Us Part 2. Like it feels as though it's not allowed to be considered bad because it is a Last of Us sequel. The first game is a favorite among the established gaming culture and gaming media. The franchise is often thrown into the front lines of conversations surrounding the console war among fans. For the gaming media, the Last of Us franchise is basically a media darling. For PlayStation fans, The Last of Us has to be consistently considered among the best IPs in games because, I don't know, PlayStation good and Xbox bad, I guess? Not to mention the fact that The Last of Us always has to be one of those games which wins all of the awards. The point I'm making is that it feels like it's not allowed to fail. It's not allowed to have problems. If it does have problems, you're supposed to overlook them. The Last of Us Part 2 has real problems and real issues with its storytelling. Why should we look the other way? Why should we not demand better from a game series which also set a standard for itself? The only way for developers and storytellers to learn what they are doing wrong is for them to get honest, unbiased feedback. It's not the player's job to make assumptions on behalf of the writers. It's their job to convey the information to us, or at least reasonably suggest stuff which can offer consistent implications for the narrative. The idea that this game deserves any kind of special treatment is bizarre. However, as I mentioned earlier in the video, there were many good and even great aspects of this game. The graphics are undeniably good, the detail is breathtaking at times. The gameplay wasn't incredible at the start, but it became that way over time as the narrative progressed. By the end of the game, the sandbox and experimental combat scenarios had been practically perfected. There was a metric ton of potential for this game. The graphics and gameplay were locked in and expertly woven into the world for the most part. Therefore, as sporadic as the writing was in this game, there were opportunities to salvage it. Despite many of its shortcomings, there was opportunity to save the narrative from becoming what it is now. Let's examine the split protagonist angle. This was a bold move to have Ellie share the spotlight with the character who killed Joel, and while it ultimately didn't work, it could have with the right approach. Ellie's story was largely single-minded in its purpose. Unfortunately, Abby's side of the story was attempting to show her backstory, show her dynamic with her friends, show us her part in a weird love triangle, introduce us to her faction in its place in the greater world to The Last of Us, explain why she chose to hunt and kill Joel, have her befriend kids from the enemy faction, become a mentor to said kids, and explore her complicated history with Owen, all in one half of a game. It's like I said earlier, There was a lack of focus. The story is too bloated and too many of the additions are forced where they really aren't needed. If you cut out about half of the stuff just previously mentioned in Abby's narrative, you could easily restructure the remaining pieces into a decent to compelling storyline. Sadly, it's pretty obvious why so much stuff was crammed into Abby's story arc. We didn't already know who she was or her friends, thus the game had to stop what it was doing and get us acquainted with everything about her. Ellie's journey was literally the main point of the game. The experience of her journey is the actual marketed concept of the game. If you don't believe me, read the back of the box. Experience the devastating physical and emotional consequences of Ellie's vengeance as you embark on a relentless pursuit of those who've wronged her. In a story so pointed in one direction, with the face of the franchise, why did the writers try everything they could to turn away from that? Why did they elect to put so much effort into things which don't matter in Ellie's journey? Had the narrative been better, I might be singing a very different tune, given how highly I came to respect the game's combat and production design by the end of it. The final result is one of disappointment and frustration. More than anything, I would like people who played this game to at least consider some questions. Is it fair to say that people who love this game, as well as people who hate this game, overreacted emotionally to multiple aspects of it and formed opinions based on those factors without properly considering the good and the bad together? Is it fair to say The Last of Us Part 2 is neither one of the worst games ever made, nor is it one of the best games ever made? Could it be that it really is just an average game? The truth is that The Last of Us Part 2's story isn't bad because Joel dies, nor is the ending of the game bad because Ellie doesn't kill Abby. Liking or disliking those two creative decisions is actually independent of the merits of the game's narrative and its ending, both of which have some real problems, as I've previously discussed. So, what is the tragedy of The Last of Us Part 2? It's the lost potential of the game and how much was left on the table by its narrative as the credits begin to roll. It's the lofty heights to which the writers clearly hoped but ultimately failed to reach by making some really risky and bold creative decisions. Overall, it's the failure of the story's ambition. Perhaps Naughty Dog knew that they had reached the mountaintop with The Last of Us. After all, it really was lightning in a bottle. Perhaps they decided that Part 2 couldn't be better than the first, so it would be best to make it bigger and bolder. Whatever the case, the final product doesn't quite cut it, and The Last of Us Part 2 sends itself out with a whimper. Although I normally prefer to avoid rating a game, I do think I should end this one with a score value to represent its distance from the first game. The Last of Us Part 2 is a game where story and narrative are so integral to the experience. Thus, any rating should reflect the damage the writing does to the end product. While The Last of Us 1 earned a 9 out of 10 rating, I find The Last of Us Part 2 earns a slightly above average rating of 6 out of 10. Had the gameplay with the combat and level design not been as enjoyable as they were, this game could have easily been a 4 or a 5 out of 10. Luckily, there were a lot of talented people who worked their butts off to make those elements of The Last of Us Part 2 as good as they possibly could be. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe, click the like button, hit that little bell for notifications so you don't miss out on any new videos as soon as they drop. Thanks again, and have yourself a great day.
Everything I have, I lost.
You have to let me go. You have to let me let you go. I need you to do that for me.